There is a woman who spent 20 years married to the godfather of Harlem, who sat beside him through gang wars and federal indictments and prison sentences and triumphant returns, who knew every associate, every enemy, every deal, every secret, who saw everything and said nothing until the man she loved was dead and his legacy was being stolen by a liar. Her name was Mayme Johnson, and in 1967, in the living room of their home on 121st Street in Harlem, she told her husband, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, something he didn't want to hear, something true, something undeniable, something that would haunt him until the day he died. Frank Lucas is not who you think he is. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson's wife, the woman who knew him better than anyone, warned him about the man who would destroy Harlem. How she watched helplessly as Bumpy refused to believe that his protege was a snake, and how, 40 years after Bumpy's death, Mayme Johnson went to war with Frank Lucas's lies and told the world the truth. That Frank Lucas was never Bumpy's right-hand man, that Frank was never his driver, that Frank was never invited to their home, that Frank was nothing but a flunky, a liar, a man Bumpy never truly trusted. Mamie Hatcher was born in 1914 in North Carolina. She moved to New York City in 1938 during the Great Migration, looking for work and opportunity. She found a job as a waitress at Hagar's, a Washington Heights club owned by actress and singer Ethel Waters. Later, she became the hostess of a Manhattan restaurant. She met Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson in April 1948 at a Harlem restaurant. He was 42 years old, a legend, the man who had survived the gang wars of the 1930s, the man who had fought Dutch Schultz and negotiated with Lucky Luciano, the man who controlled the numbers racket in Harlem. Mamie was in her early 30s, beautiful, sharp, no nonsense. Bumpy was immediately drawn to her, not just because she was attractive, though she was, but because she didn't fawn over him. She didn't treat him like a celebrity or a criminal or a king. She treated him like a man. They talked, they laughed, they connected. 6 months later, they were driving past 116th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue in Bumpy's Cadillac when he suddenly turned to her and said, "Mamie, I think you and I should go ahead and get married." Mamie was stunned, but she kept her composure. "Is that right?" she said. "Yes, that's right," Bumpy said, and kept on driving. 2 weeks later, they were married in a civil ceremony. Being Bumpy's wife came with privileges. She was treated like royalty wherever she went. She was showered with gifts and jewelry on a steady basis. Bumpy bought her furs. They traveled to Europe together. She lived a life most people could only dream of, but it also came with complications. I was constantly accosted by other women who were in love with Bumpy and wanted me out of the way. Mamie later wrote in her memoir, "At first I was upset, but then I pretty much learned to ignore them. Like Bumpy said, they wouldn't even be stepping to me if they didn't realize that I was the one real woman in his life." Mamie wasn't naive. She knew what Bumpy did for a living. She knew about the numbers game. She knew about the violence. She knew about the deals with the Italian mob. But she also knew the man behind the legend, the man who read Shakespeare, the man who played chess for hours, the man who cared about Harlem, the man who wanted to protect his community even while profiting from its vices. And because she knew him so well, she also knew when someone was playing him, someone like Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas arrived in Harlem in the late 1940s as a teenager from North Carolina, poor, ambitious, hungry. By his own account, he met Bumpy Johnson at a pool hall around 1950. Bumpy supposedly took him under his wing, bought him clothes, gave him a place to stay, mentored him for 20 years. According to Frank, he was Bumpy's driver for 15 years, his right-hand man, his confidant, his protege. According to Mayme Johnson, that's all bullshit. Frank Lucas was never his driver, Mayme said in a 2007 interview. Never. Bumpy drove for himself, the only person that used to drive a little bit, and that was back in the 1930s, was Freddie Parson and J.J. I think Frank drove him only 2 times, and somebody threw a brick in the car. He was never Bumpy's driver, especially no 15-year stretch. She continued. The real relationship between Bumpy and Frank was basically Frank was just a person that would hold Bumpy's coat and follow him around, very distant, very poor. He had no real relationship with Bumpy. Bumpy had friends like Nat Pettigrew, Junie Bird, Sonny Chance, the Capuzza brothers, and all them people like that. Frank Lucas did not fit into that circle. He was never invited to the house. And we entertained a lot and had dinners and things for different people, and he was never invited. Never invited to the house. Think about what that means. Bumpy Johnson, a man who hosted dinners for politicians, jazz musicians, businessmen, and gangsters, never once invited Frank Lucas into his home. Mayme lived with Bumpy. She saw who came to the house. She saw who Bumpy trusted. She saw who he considered family. Frank Lucas was not one of them. Frank wasn't nothing but a flunky, Mayme said, and one that Bumpy never did really trust. But Frank was around. That much is true. He was on the periphery, a minor figure, someone who ran errands, someone who held coats, someone Bumpy tolerated but never fully embraced. And Mayme noticed something about Frank that Bumpy didn't want to see. Frank was a liar. Bumpy would say, Mayme recalled, you can trust a thief quicker than a liar, because a thief steals money because he needs money, but a liar lies for the hell of it. Bumpy knew Frank was a liar, but he didn't see Frank as a threat. He saw him as harmless, a small-time hustler who would never amount to much. Mayme saw something different. She saw ambition. She saw ruthlessness. She saw a man who was watching, learning, waiting. And in 1967, she told Bumpy what she saw. It happened on a weeknight in the spring of 1967. Bumpy was home, tired. His health was declining. He was 61 years old and had spent most of his life fighting the mob, fighting the feds, fighting other gangsters, fighting to stay alive. He was sitting in his chair, reading the newspaper, when Mayme sat down across from him. We need to talk about Frank, she said. Bumpy looked up. What about him? He's not who you think he is. What's that supposed to mean? Mayme hesitated. She knew this conversation would be difficult. Bumpy didn't like being told he was wrong, especially about people. He's out there telling people he's your right-hand man, Mayme said, that he runs things for you, that you trust him with everything. Let him talk, Bumpy said. It doesn't hurt me. It does hurt you, Mayme said, because people believe him. And when people believe Frank speaks for you, they start coming to him instead of you. They start making deals with him. They start thinking Frank Lucas is Bumpy Johnson's successor. Bumpy set down the newspaper. And he's doing more than just talking, Mayme continued. I've been hearing things from people in the neighborhood, from the wives of your associates. Frank's selling heroin, a lot of it. And it's not the usual stuff. It's stronger, purer. People are dying. Frank's always been in the game, Bumpy said. That's not new. This is different, Mayme said. He's not working under the Italians anymore. He's going around them. He's building his own operation, and he's using your name to do it. Bumpy was quiet. I don't trust him, Mayme said. I never have, and I think you need to cut him loose before he does something you can't fix. Bumpy looked at her for a long moment. You don't like Frank because he's loud, Bumpy said finally, because he talks too much, because he's not one of the old-timers, but that doesn't make him dangerous. It's not about whether I like him, Mayme said. It's about what he's going to do when you're not here anymore. I'm not going anywhere. "You're 61 years old, Bumpy. You've had a heart condition for years. You can't run these streets forever. And when you're gone, Frank Lucas is going to take everything you built and turn it into something you wouldn't recognize." Bumpy stood up, slowly, the way he always moved when he was trying to control his temper. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his voice cold, "but I know who Frank Lucas is. He's a hustler, a small-timer. He's not smart enough or strong enough to take over anything, and even if he tried, the commission would shut him down in a week." "The commission didn't stop you," Mayme said. Bumpy stared at her. "And it won't stop Frank," Mayme continued, "because Frank doesn't care about the rules. He doesn't care about respect or tradition or keeping the peace. He only cares about money, and he's willing to do things you would never do to get it." "Like what?" "Like flooding Harlem with heroin so pure that kids are dying from one bag. Like targeting teenagers who've never used before. Like destroying the same community you spent your life protecting." Bumpy didn't respond. Mayme stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at Harlem, the streets her husband had controlled for 30 years. "I'm your wife," she said quietly. "I see things you don't see because I'm not in the game. I see Frank Lucas for what he is, and I'm telling you he's going to be a problem. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon." She turned to face him. "And when that happens, it'll be too late to stop him." Bumpy walked over to Chimter. He put his hand on her shoulder. "You worry too much," he said, but Mayme saw something in his eyes that told her he knew she was right. He just didn't want to admit it. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968. He was eating breakfast at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, chicken, grits, coffee, when he suffered a massive heart attack. He collapsed. His childhood friend, Junie Bird, cradled him in his arms. Another friend, Finley Hoskins, was there too. Bumpy was rushed to Harlem Hospital. He was pronounced dead on arrival. He was 62 years old. Mayme got the call from Junie Bird. She rushed to the hospital. But by the time she arrived, Bumpy was gone. The man she'd loved for 20 years. The man who had given her everything. The man who had protected Harlem. Dead. And within days, Frank Lucas began his takeover. Mayme watched it happen in real time. Frank started telling people he'd been at Wells Restaurant when Bumpy died. That Bumpy had died in his arms. That Bumpy's last words were instructions to Frank about how to run things. All lies. "Frank Lucas was not at the wake," Mayme said years later. "He was not at the funeral. I don't know where he was, but he was not there. Maybe he dreamed it." But the damage was done. People believed Frank's story. They believed he was Bumpy's chosen successor. They believed Frank spoke with Bumpy's authority. And Frank used that belief to build the largest heroin empire Harlem had ever seen. Within 2 years, Frank Lucas was making an estimated $1 million per day from heroin sales. He employed his entire extended family, brothers, cousins, friends from North Carolina, in an operation so insular here it was nearly impossible to infiltrate. They called themselves the Country Boys. He bought heroin directly from suppliers in Thailand's Golden Triangle, bypassing the Italian mob entirely. He smuggled it into the United States through military connections. He cut it himself to maintain purity. He called his product Blue Magic. It was approximately 98% pure heroin, 5 times stronger than anything else on the street. And it was killing people. Addicts who were used to heroin cut to 10 to 20% purity were suddenly using heroin that was 98% pure. One bag could kill someone who'd been using for years. Frank didn't care. Dead bodies meant his product was strong. Strong product meant demand. Demand meant money. By 1970, Harlem was drowning in blue magic. Overdose deaths reached record highs. Entire families collapsed. Crime skyrocketed. The neighborhood Bumpy Johnson had protected for 30 years was being destroyed by the man Mayme had warned him about, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. For nearly 40 years, Mayme Johnson lived quietly. She raised her grandchildren, she attended church, she kept Bumpy's memory alive among the people who had known him. She never spoke publicly about her husband. She never gave interviews. She never told her side of the story until 2007. That's when the movie American Gangster was released, directed by Ridley Scott, starring Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas and Russell Crowe as Detective Richie Roberts. The movie portrayed Frank Lucas as a criminal genius, a man who outsmarted the Italian mob, built a heroin empire, and learned everything from his mentor, Bumpy Johnson. The movie showed Bumpy and Frank as close, as father and son almost. It showed Frank at Bumpy's side constantly. It showed Bumpy dying in Frank's arms, passing the torch. Mayme Johnson, 93 years old, living in a nursing home in Philadelphia, saw the trailers on BET, and she was furious. Frank Lucas's entire interaction with Bumpy in that movie is based on lies, she told a journalist. Frank Lucas never spent one night in my house. We did not live in a brownstone, and Frank Lucas did not live with us. He was never invited. She decided to write a book, not to make money, not for fame, but to set the record straight, to tell the world who Frank Lucas really was. In February 2008, Mayme Johnson published Harlem Godfather, The Rap on My Husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, co-written with author Karen E. Quinones Miller. The book was part memoir, part history, part indictment. Mayme described her life with Bumpy, the good and the bad, the luxury and the danger, the love and the loneliness. But the most explosive parts of the book were about Frank Lucas. Mayme systematically dismantled every claim Frank had ever made. Frank's claim, he was Bumpy's driver for 15 years. Mayme's response, Frank Lucas was never his driver, never. Bumpy drove for himself. I think Frank drove him only 2 times, and somebody threw a brick in the car. He was never Bumpy's driver, especially no 15-year stretch. Frank's claim, he lived with Bumpy and Mayme for 6 months. Mayme's response, Frank Lucas never spent one night in my house. Frank's claim, Bumpy mentored him for 20 years. Mayme's response, the real relationship between Bumpy and Frank was basically Frank was just a person that would hold Bumpy's coat and follow him around. Very distant, very poor. He had no real relationship with Bumpy. Frank's claim, Bumpy died in his arms at Wells Restaurant. Mayme's response, Frank Lucas was not at the wake. He was not at the funeral. I don't know where he was, but he was not there. My husband was with me. He was nowhere around the night my husband died. Mayme's most devastating quote came in an interview promoting the book. Frank Lucas is a damn liar, and I want the world to know it. She continued, Junie Bird's gone, Nat Pettigrew's gone, Sonny Chance is gone, Finley Hoskins is gone. Frank would never have said any garbage like that if one of them were alive, because he'd know they'd come after him. I bet he thought I was gone too, but I'm not. I'm 93, and I don't have Alzheimer's or dementia. Frank Lucas is a liar. The book became a sensation, not because it was salacious, but because it was true. Mayme Johnson had no reason to lie. She had nothing to gain. She was 93 years old, living in a nursing home, nearing the end of her life. But she wanted the world to know the truth about her husband, and the truth about Frank Lucas. Frank, of course, tried to defend himself. He claimed Bumpy kept his home life and business life separate, that Mayme didn't know what Bumpy was really doing, that she was just a wife who didn't understand the streets. But the timeline didn't support Frank's story. Bumpy Johnson was in prison from 1952 to 1963. That's 11 years. When he got out, he only lived 5 more years. from 1963 to 1968. Frank claimed he was Bumpy's driver and protege for 15 years. The math doesn't work. Unless Frank was Bumpy's driver while Bumpy was in Alcatraz, which is absurd, the 15-year claim is a lie. And if that's a lie, what else did Frank lie about? Mayme Johnson died on May 1st, 2009 in Philadelphia. She was 94 years old. The cause of death was respiratory failure. She died knowing that her book had accomplished what she'd set out to do: expose Frank Lucas as a fraud. 2 days before she died, she received word that a film company was negotiating to purchase the rights to Harlem Godfather. She was tickled pink to tell people she was an author at age 93, said her friend Henry Perkins, a Harlem restaurateur. Boy, it really made her proud to finally get that book done. Mayme's book didn't just challenge Frank Lucas's narrative, it redefined Bumpy Johnson's legacy. Because for decades, Bumpy had been portrayed in movies and TV shows as a mentor to Frank Lucas, as the man who created the heroin kingpin who destroyed Harlem. Mayme made it clear, Bumpy didn't create Frank Lucas. Frank was a flunky, a liar, a man Bumpy never trusted. If anyone was responsible for Frank's rise, it was Frank himself, and the vacuum Bumpy's death created. Mayme died knowing she'd protected her husband's legacy, and in doing so, she'd told a truth that Hollywood didn't want to hear. Frank Lucas was never the Godfather's protege. He was just a liar who got lucky when the real Godfather died. Frank Lucas was arrested in January 1975. He was convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 70 years in prison. He cooperated with prosecutors, giving up over 150 people, including 30 members of his own family and dozens of corrupt law enforcement officers. His sentence was reduced to 15 years. He was released in 1981. He was arrested again in 1984. He served 7 more years. He was released in 1991. He died on May 30th, 2019, at the age of 88. In his final years, Frank Lucas gave interviews where he expressed regret. He told the Newark Star-Ledger in 2013, "I probably did more damage than I did good. I probably did, and that's a fact. At that time, I wasn't aware of what I was doing. All I knew is I was making big dollars. A bad business was a good business. It was a horrible business, put it that way. I was in the heroin business, the worst you can get. You can't get no lower than that, and I was in it, up to my head." But he never admitted that he lied about Bumpy Johnson. Even at the end, Frank couldn't let go of the myth he'd created. The myth that he was Bumpy's right-hand man. The myth that he learned everything from a legend. Because without that myth, Frank Lucas was just another drug dealer. And legends are built on myths, even when the truth is standing right there, telling you otherwise. Mayme Johnson spent 20 years married to Bumpy Johnson. She watched him fight the Italian mob. She watched him survive Alcatraz. She watched him return to Harlem and try to hold together a neighborhood that was falling apart. She warned him about Frank Lucas. She told him Frank was a liar. She told him Frank would destroy everything Bumpy had built. Bumpy didn't listen, not because he trusted Frank, but because he was tired, because he was old, because he didn't have the strength to fight another war. And 8 months after Mayme's warning, Bumpy was dead. 40 years later, when Hollywood made Frank Lucas into a hero, Mayme Johnson, 93 years old, living in a nursing home, picked up a pen and went to war. She wrote a book. She gave interviews. She called Frank Lucas a damn liar on national television, and she won, because the truth always wins. Eventually, it just takes someone brave enough to tell it. That wraps it up for today. Mayme Johnson told her husband in 1967 that Frank Lucas was a liar who would destroy Harlem. Bumpy didn't listen. 8 months later, he was dead. 40 years after that, when Hollywood turned Frank into a legend, Mayme 93 years old, wrote a book and exposed every lie Frank ever told. She called him a flunky. She said he was never invited to their home. She said Bumpy never trusted him, and she made sure the world knew the truth before she died. Sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones told by people who need you to believe they were important. If this story hit you, drop a comment below. Subscribe for more stories where the truth fights back. See you in the next one.